Hi, this is Bob Sorrentino from Italian Roots and Genealogy, and I'm here today with Josephine Pasquarello, and we're going to talk about her background, her family, and her great book, Life's Journey. So, welcome, Josephine. Thanks for being here.
And thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, before we get into the book, which I found, it was joyous and sad at the same time, and you know, we'll talk about it. But
Okay.
before we do that, where's your family from, and what got you the bug to start doing the research?
Well, we're um, both sides of my family came from Italy to South Philadelphia, and they stayed in South Philadelphia. So they've been there since 1888. And then uh, the Pasquarello side of the family, which is my father's side of the family, I started to hang out with my Uncle George and my Uncle Nick when I got very much older in my life, probably I was about 50. And they would say stories to me, and I would go home and write them down because I had never heard any of those because my father died when I was little. And yet my mother told us a lot of stories, but these were different stories. So I started just to put all these stories together. And I said, you know what? I'm going to start searching this out, meaning my family, my grandparents, and great grandparents. And I even took a trip over to Italy to the town where my grandmother is from, and just went into the town hall. And the gentleman that worked there, he helped me. We found her birth in 1881 and the name of the street. She lived on a farm. I never knew any of this. So I became involved in that, and I just put it all together and found out more stories and wrote her story, her life
Yeah,
story.
yeah, that's fantastic. So they came very early, 1888. That's early.
Yeah, my grandfather came over with his father, his mother, and his two brothers. Raphael Pasquarello is my grandfather, and that's who married Giltrude, is my grandfather, and she became Giltrude Dululo Pasquarello. So yeah, he came in 1888, and she came over in 1899 on a solo trip by herself to marry Raphael.
And
I never
so
went.
I know what you mean. I know what you mean. I'm looking going. I wish I could go back there and stay there. It's so nice.
Oh yeah, I'm planning a trip to go over to the still in Abruzzo because that's both sides of my family. We're going to go over to Pescara. I want to go visit the town hall in Atri and in Pescara for the other side of the family.
Yeah, and it's so nice being back there. We went last June. I'm hoping we're going to get there again this year, maybe in September, but we'll have to see.
Yeah.
Um, so so now do you know why they came? Do you know why your grandfather came? Your grandmother we know came. I guess she had an arranged marriage, but
That's correct. Well, my grandfather, well, my great grandparents and my grandfather and his brothers came over to get a better life. And when they came over, they went to South Philadelphia. And by the time Giltrude came over, my great grandfather had purchased his house down in South Philadelphia. So they all were working. They all were working they weren't hucksters in the beginning, but they were working on the docks with the produce and everything. And they just started to make a wonderful life over here. I mean, when my grandmother came, my great grandmother, they must have had some kind of money because they took her to John Wanamaker's, which was the number one store, uh, and bought her wedding dress. And they had their own home. They were doing quite well. So they came over to make a better life.
yeah, and they did. I mean, you could
Yeah.
see that in the book.
Mhm.
And so now what do you know about them back in Italy?
Well, for my grandmother DeLulo, I know that she lived on a farm and they sent her over here to make a better life for her. And she had a sister who was a year older, Aunt Christina. Aunt Christina came over like 17 years later. But I just found out recently, after the book was published, that Aunt Christina really went over to Chicago, married an Italian man there, and someone sent me the divorce document from the town hall in Chicago, and it stated that she married this man. They didn't even give you his name. He deserted her. Then
Wow.
she came over to South Philadelphia to be with my grandmother and ended up marrying a man who was a widower who had three daughters. So my grandmother ended up having her sister here until my grandmother passed away. And then Raphael Pasquarello, they're from Potenza. So they came on the ship. Now I found my great grandmother and two of my uncles, but I cannot find my great grandfather and my grandfather on that manifest for some reason. But I know they're on there because they all came together. But yeah, as back in those days, you know, they didn't work. The mother, the female of their home, they all stayed home and cooked. So in the house was only the Pasquarellos. They lived together. Like Aunt Christina, when she moved into the house, there were three different families in that little row house in South Philadelphia. There were 13 or 14 people.
Yeah, and I don't think that was unusual.
No, it wasn't. No, not at all.
Because I see that on some of the census records that I've seen. You know, either they were boarders or they were, you know, a couple of generations from the same family and things like that. Um, so, you know, I know you chronicle a lot of it in the book. So, and what I really liked about the book, and I wish I could write it, it tells the story, but it tells it in a family kind of way. It's not like just a historic account, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. Well, I think the reason why that is as a child, I had heard all the stories about all those people. So it was from the heart to write the story.
Yeah, and like I said, it was, you know, it starts off, you know, very, very happy. She comes over, she gets married, the family welcomes her and all of that. Uh, and so now is it your grandfather, your great grandfather? It was your grandfather that had the I'll
The
say
affair.
affair for lack of a better word.
Yeah, that was my grandfather. That's Raphael. Raphael had the affair. Yes.
Yeah, so I'll let you, without giving away too much, I'll let you tell the story, you know, as much as you want about your grandmother and how coming over and what eventually happened.
Well, she came over in September of 1899, and by May, she's married to Raphael, 1900. And 9 months later, she gives birth to her first child, Aunt Rosie, and everything's going good. Raphael is working with the produce, and they're living with my great grandparents and Raphael's two brothers. And then she gives birth to the first, and then she gets pregnant right away again. And one of the great grandparents died. So now basically she's the woman of the house. And so my grandfather then decides he needs to make more money. So he's going to go work on the dock, but he's going to be a bartender, becomes the manager of a bar. And my grandmother is just having baby after baby. The second baby they had is my father, Michael. And everything is good. They're living in the house. She's happy as can be. And then I would say probably it's about 10 years into their marriage. And by then, I believe she had had 5 or 6 of the children, the aunts and the uncles and my dad. And she becomes sick and she doesn't understand what's going on. And she stays home all the time. So she's not understanding English all that well, and she doesn't really speak it. So she has a dear friend who was on the ship with her coming across, who helps her to speak to the doctors and the nurses and to go to Pennsylvania Hospital to find out why she's becoming ill and what's going on with her body. And then I can't tell you what it is though, right?
No, let's keep that a secret. So people buy the book. And you know, it was well, first of all, I mean, you got a real glimpse into what life was like, I felt, you
Yeah.
know, for those, you know, 20, 30 years, I guess, from, you know, 1900, I guess to 1930 or 1933 or something like that. And so your dad basically he became the man of the house when your great grandfather passed away. Yeah.
Well, Raphael was the man of the house when his father died, but my father in 1921, at the age of 19, became the father and the man of the house with the 9 kids because his father had died from that illness in 1921. So my father, even before his father died, had to go work the streets. So he became a huckster, having his push cart and going up and down the streets. And eventually he did have a cart there at the Italian market, which is the oldest Italian open air market in the United States down here in South Philadelphia. It's called 9th Street. But so my father had to work there and he had to make enough money. His mother was home and all the siblings. But then what she came up with, my grandmother, is that Aunt Christina came to her and said, listen, you can get a job in the summer from April till October working the farms. So what she would do, she would take like the last 6 of the kids with her to the farm and they would work the farm. And the older siblings would stay home and work in the garment factories down in South Philadelphia. So they could have enough money to make sure they ate and lived. And my grandmother sold that house on League Street and moved to a bigger house on 10th Street after he died. So I don't know if she was doing financially better or what, but things were looking up a little bit.
Well,
Except
it
now,
sounded, yeah, it sounded like it. I guess between everybody working and I guess I guess that a sense of finance must have been instilled by your great grandfather because
right?
he was able to buy a house very quickly.
And on the 1900 census, it tells you that he paid for that house $5,000, and that was a lot of money
That's
back then.
it's a ton of money. Yeah.
He paid for that, and he came over in 1888 with his wife and 3 sons. And how did he come up with $5,000 and have, excuse me, this wonderful house, beautiful furniture, taking care of his sons? And then Giltrude comes over, and they take her to Wanamaker's to get a beautiful gown and give her a big wedding.
Now, did the families, did they know each other in Italy or?
We believe it was the priest from the church, which was Our Lady of Good Counsel, which is no longer there. It was for the Southern Italians. It was built for them. Was in touch with the priest in Ateleta, where Grandma Giltrude was from, and that connected and sent her over. He paid my great grandfather some money to get her to come over, and she was really very pretty. So I believe that my great grandfather knew that Giltrude wouldn't have a hard time. A man would not be disappointed when he saw how beautiful she was.
We'll be right back.
Experience Italy like never before, traveling with a scheduled group or create your own bespoke tour with friends with philitaly.com. Pack your bags and follow Phil. That's www.philitaly.co. Yeah, and no, I didn't realize that they would do this back then. But she lived with the family before they got married. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, was that I thought that was very unusual, but maybe it wasn't.
I'm not for sure, because across the street there were a couple of families on that street that were Pasquarellos. So I don't know if they all intermixed or how they went about that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Where they all connect. Like when one of the Pasquarellos died, he's in our family plot, but he's not one of us. He's one of the neighbors from across the street.
Mm.
But we believe that he was a cousin to my grandfather. So, back then they all took care of each other. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
They didn't have a place to bury him. So they came over and said to my great grandfather, can we bury him in your plot? And he said, yeah. And that little boy's buried in our plot. So
well, yeah. And I guess if they had the space, and it was obviously a very tight knit community, and they probably all knew each other. So now I don't recall the name, but the Gertrude's friend married somebody, and
oh, you mean Sophia?
Yeah. Yes. Now, was her husband connected? If you know what I
Yeah,
mean.
I want to do a little story on him. Yeah, he was. My grandfather hated him because he was mean.
Yeah, I got that sense. I got
Yeah,
that sense.
I didn't want to dive too deep into him because I didn't want to make him like a main character because Sophia and Giltrude together were beautiful. I didn't want to
Mhm.
take that away because of Sophia marrying a jerk like that.
And but she Sophia met him. She met him here, right? That wasn't
Sophia
a
was an arranged marriage
oh,
also.
it was also arranged.
Oh
Okay, I didn't
yeah,
remember that. Yeah.
yes, that was an arranged marriage.
Um, and yeah, yeah, that was funny. But also your family, um, they would lend money, but they weren't they did it seemed like they did it more out of kindness than
Compassion for each other because
yeah.
let's face it, when we first came over, we were shunned. As a matter of fact, the area that I'm speaking about in Philadelphia, where they all went to, was generally in that time the Irish. The Irish said, "We're not staying here with the Italians," and they left. So the Italians took over that whole area. They weren't allowed out of that area, really. As years went by, they were more free to roam. And if you remember, my grandmother was told, don't go out of the area
Hmm.
because,
Hmm.
and you know something, Bob, I'm 74, and I can remember when my mother moved us from South Philly to Southwest Philly into an Irish neighborhood. Oh, we were called mean, mean names, and that's 1955, and it still was going on then. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know what you mean. And it's funny. I never experienced that myself. My family is from Corona in Queens. That's where my parents both kind of grew up.
Uh-huh.
And that was all Italian. But I mean, it did happen in New York where, in Brooklyn, for example, I interviewed somebody and they had the Irish church
Yes.
and the Irish didn't want the Italians in the Irish church. And the Italians were able to get a piece of land from the bishop
Right.
eventually. And
Yes.
they built an Italian church a couple of blocks away.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it's, you wouldn't think that, but I grew up in a place that was kind of more mixed. I mean, um, I guess in the late 1800s, it was Irish. Then Germans were there too. In fact, during World War II, or just prior to World War II, they used to have Hitler rallies in College Point where I grew up.
Because it was
That's how
German.
German it was. That's how German it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, but I never experienced it too much because my school there were Irish kids, there were German American kids, there were Italian kids.
You all were accepted because it was an entire mix, which is not.
Yeah, it was a big mix and it was a small place and everybody knew each other. So I didn't experience that too much growing up as a kid.
Uh-huh,
Um, I do find it interesting now and that, my wife is half Italian and half Puerto Rican.
uh-huh.
And I say to her, I said, we, you hear some of this now. We never called each other by those derogatory names. Other
Right.
people would call us that, but we would never use those words.
Yeah.
Um, but I guess times change. I don't know. Or maybe we're just getting older and thinking like old people or something.
No, what I learned from that, like when I was a kid, I used to get insulted or my feelings would get hurt, but you can call me anything you want now. I don't care because I know who I am. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly. I feel the same way. And I say, when we were growing up, if somebody asked you what you are, you would say Italian. You would never say Italian American.
Oh, I agree.
You would just say you were Italian. I was Italian. My friend was Irish. Somebody else was, that's the way you answered the question when people asked.
Yeah.
Um, so now, so how about your mom's family now? Are you going to do something about her, or what research
Oh,
have you found out about her?
wrote a book on my mother. The first book, it's called Love and Loyalty. That is about my mother. My mother married Michael, the second child of my grandmother and grandfather. And she was an only child. She came from Italy in 1910. Well, 1912. Her father came in 1910. He worked for 2 years in South Philly to send money back every month. And then when they had enough, they came across, meeting my other grandmother and my mother. And she met my father. She had never had a date in her life. She was 26 years old.
Wow.
Was a huckster on the street, and she used to come out of the factory. She would beg the girls, let me go down and get lunch. And they would go, why? You're going to walk by Frankenstein? And she'd go, yeah. And that's how she met him. And he took her on a date and dated her for 3 months. And they were on the trolley car coming from Center City through South Philly. And he leaned in for a kiss, and she said, oh no, you want to kiss me? He said, yeah. She said, you have to marry me first. And they got married at the church, at the City Hall in 3 months and had 12 kids.
Wow. 12 kids. And her father didn't want her to get married, right?
No, her father didn't want her to get married. He wanted her to stay home with him because she worked. And he had an easy life with her and him working. So he said, no. And my mother was 26 years old.
Yeah. And that's, that was an old lady back then, right?
And yet still had 12 kids. And started having babies when she was 27 years old. Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible. That's incredible. So you have my mom's family, they're originally 11, 2 died when they were young, but so they were 9. So you obviously have a lot of cousins.
Oh yeah. Like people say to me all the time on Facebook, do you know this name? And they'll say the first name of the Pasquarello, and I go, you know what? Sometimes I do. And I say to them, look, they're probably a cousin, but I have no clue because there's tons of Pasquarellos, you know what I mean? It's a very popular name.
So now so I know what your father did, young. What did he continue to do that, or did he move into something else as he got older?
When he was on 9th Street, they came and they wanted money from him. And he said, nope, I'm out of here. And he goes to 7th Street, which is a shopping street, but it's Jewish people there. He left the Italians to go over into the area of the Jewish people. And we lived on 6th Street. So at the end of 6th Street, he had his cart there. But then they said, we want you out of here. So there was a shop for sale. So he purchased the store and opened a grocery store, but every day went to the docks to get all his fresh produce. And that's what my father did there. So he always stayed in that business.
That's great. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And in Italy, they still do that. I when we were there, I don't know if I said something or the driver just happened to mention, and there was either, it was a fruit cart or it was a little store or something like that. And he said, they don't need refrigerators. He says they go in the morning, they get the produce and the fruit and they sell it. And tomorrow morning he'll go out and he'll buy more because he doesn't have to have a refrigerator because there's nothing ever left over.
Well, my mother went to the store every day. Now there were 14 of us, you know what I mean? But even when it was dwindling down, she would still go to the store to get the fresh lettuce, tomatoes, cucumbers. She would do the same thing. I think she was so accustomed to everything had to be fresh. Like she didn't like canned foods and stuff like that. She thought you were crazy if you opened up a can of something.
So was it crazy town in your house?
At times. But I will tell you this, we had to be home at 6 o'clock for dinner, and we had 2 big kitchen tables, and they always were mainly pushed together, and we all sat around and did our thing. We talked, and sometimes there were like, the boys, they get into heated, like, well, who wants to beat this one up because he won't listen or something. But generally speaking, considering, yeah, it was pretty good. But there were battles at times, and especially because the 4 boys want to push us. The last 4 of my generation, I'm 4 girls at the bottom. In the middle, there's 3 boys and 1 girl. And at the top, it's 1 boy and 3 girls. So we were considered the babies when my father died. So everybody used to try and push us around. And after a while, we didn't pay attention to them no more. So no, my mom kept it together. My mother did it all on her own when my father died for 19 years. My mother, because her father was deceased, her mother was deceased. She had nobody. And she kept it together for us. She was a really good mother.
That's amazing. So what was the spread between your brothers and sisters? How many years?
Well, the oldest, Ralph, he was 18. I think he was 18 years old. He was 15 years older than me. So he was 18 years older than the baby. But my mother, like us last 4 girls, were all 18 months apart. Wow. So she got pregnant, had a baby, would go to the University of Pennsylvania, give birth, and at that time you stayed in the hospital for 10 days. My father then took us, put us in the orphanage so he could keep working. So we had to stay in the orphanage for 10 days. Then my mother would come home, he would pick all us up, and she would start all over again, breastfeeding for 9 months, and then boom, she'd be pregnant again for 9 months. So she used to say a lot, if your father didn't die when he did, I would have had 1 to 2 more. She wanted 13 or 14 kids, and she was an only. I don't know how she did it.
Yeah, it's hard to, I can't even imagine. I can't even imagine.
She knew how to turn us off, because I said to her one time, Mom, when I was like a baby, how did you like take care of us? I mean, you had all these kids. And so what she did in the morning, she would put us 4 girls on the floor and open the cabinet doors below. And we were allowed to pull everything out, bang the pots all day long. She never heard us. How could you do that? Yeah.
I guess you get numb after a while.
You do. She had to be numb. Do you know what I mean? And she did it all on her own. It's amazing, like that we didn't drive her to jump off the bridge. You know?
Yeah, yeah. So now so the house. I mean, how did you split up the bedrooms and everything?
Well, our first house in South Philly was very little. So the front bedroom, the back bedroom were the 4 boys, and my older brother Ralph, if he were alive, would be 89, I believe. He told us that the 3 boys, and then he would lay at the bottom, and they would push their feet into his face and everything. Us girls, we were 6 girls in the middle room, and the 2 youngest were in the front bedroom in 2 cribs with my mother and my father. Yeah.
That's amazing.
You know what? You have to do what you have to do. And I think you just get accustomed that it is the way that it is. But as long as I believe my mother and father felt that we were home at 6 o'clock for dinner, and that my father, when he came home every night, he would close his store, then he would come home, eat dinner, then go back and open the store, because up on the 2nd floor, he rented out to the gamblers and he did numbers. And then he would come home at 12 o'clock and he'd go upstairs and count 12 heads and then go to sleep and then get up real early the next morning and start. I don't know how he did it either.
Well, my mom's family, like I said, there were 9, and my uncles, they used to share the beds, because if some uncles would work at night and some would work during the day, so they would have shifts in the bed, and they didn't have a lot of money. I mean, they did have a house. I mean, they were able to purchase a house at some point.
But they had each other.
Yeah, but when they were growing up, they didn't have a lot of money and they didn't have a lot of meat. So they had a game where if you had put your fork down a certain way, somebody else could steal your meat out of your dish. So you had to be very careful which way you put your fork. And my oldest uncle, he stayed behind in Italy when he was 2 years old. When my grandparents came, they left him behind with his great grandparents, and he eventually inherited the house over there in Torito. And my cousin told me that there were 2 rooms in the house. It was a 2-room house. She said there was the bedroom for my parents and the youngest baby. She said, and then there was the other room, which was the kitchen, the living room, the bedroom for all the other kids. The family room, the play, whatever you want to call it. And they had the fireplace, which was the stove.
Yes.
And the heat.
Yeah.
And there was no indoor plumbing. And we're talking 1950 now.
Over there though, right?
Over there, yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. When my mother first came to Philadelphia as a young girl, they had an outhouse in the backyard where the chickens lived. But I said to her, Mom, what did you do in the middle of the night? Oh no, you kept a pot in there. Then you went out in the morning. She said, you didn't go out at night. So, you have to do what you have to do, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, West, we grew up with everything, but although, we thought it was a burden, I guess, having only, 4 television stations, right?
Yeah. Remember 360 something? You got it.
And you know, I think if you show a rotary phone to kids nowadays, they want to know what to do with it.
That's right. We're wiser.
Yeah, I mean, I remember, you know, we had the two phones. We have one upstairs and one downstairs, but it was
Yeah.
the same line, of course. You know, the
Oh, yeah.
extension phone.
Did you ever share a line? We used to have this.
We never did. I did have a couple of friends who shared a line.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you could be on the phone listening to those other two people on their phone talking. It was weird.
Yeah. No, we didn't have that, but it was always, you know, I'm on the phone, you know,
Yeah, yeah.
when somebody would pick up the one downstairs. But I'll tell you a funny phone story. We digress a little bit.
Yeah.
My dad works for the Daily News in New York City. He was a photographer,
Oh, wow.
and
Nice.
he would run for many years. He would chair the press photographers ball that they would have in New York City, and that's where they would give all the awards for the photos and things like that.
Uh-huh.
And I guess I was about 16, and the phone rings, and I pick up the phone, and the person says, "Is Nick Sorrentino there?" And I said, "No, he's out." He said, I said, "He'll be back, you know, later." I said, "Who's calling?" And he said, "Henny Youngman."
Oh,
So,
no.
so I say, "No, who is this really?"
Yeah.
So he says, "It's Henny Youngman." And it sounded like Henny Youngman, but, you know, I'm like, "Okay, it's Henny Youngman." I said, "Whatever." I said, "What do you want me to tell him?" He said, "Well, tell him, you know, the ball was that night and he was going to be performing or something." So I said, "All right, I'll tell him Henny Youngman called." So my father comes home and he said, "Didn't anybody call?" I said, "Some guy called, said he was Henny Youngman, but I don't know who it really was." Oh, so before he hung up, he was laughing on the phone, right? Because I didn't believe him. He says, "I'll prove it to you. I'm going to send you a little check." So the next day after the ball, my father came home. I wish I saved him. He had two little checks about, you know, this big
Yeah.
from Henny Youngman, the banks of the Hudson.
And you didn't save it?
I didn't save it. It's probably in a, who knows? It's probably in a box someplace or something like that. But that's my funny Henny Youngman story. And for people who are not in their 60s and 70s, Henny Youngman was a
Yeah.
famous comedian.
Yeah. Yeah. How old was he when he passed away? Was he like in his upper years?
Yeah, I think he was
Something
probably
you
he
never
was
heard?
probably at least late 70s or something
Yeah.
like that. I mean, he was I guess pretty old back then when he had called. But that, you know, my father said that really was Henny Youngman, stupid, you know. I didn't know. I thought it was somebody playing a gag. I didn't know.
So your father knew some famous people in the industry? Is that what it was? Because he was a photographer?
Well, he would meet a lot of people. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, I have photos. He took photos of Jackie Gleason, Elizabeth Taylor,
Oh, wow.
Princess Grace, Cary Grant,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
you know, a bunch of people, you know, getting off a train, usually in New York City. They would have
That's
them
how he
getting
would
off
see them.
yeah.
Wow.
You know, this was, you know, before flying was a regular thing, and they would come into New York by train.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so yeah, so he took a lot of pictures of fame. I'm trying to think of who else. Oh, a bunch of people. Um, and and then also just regular news, you know, car crashes and plane crashes and, you know,
Yeah.
hurricanes and things like that. So we when I was growing up, I was my brother and sister and I, we were a little bit of celebrities in our little town because if my father had, especially if he had like the front page or the centerfold, you know, everybody say, "Oh, your dad's photos are in the paper today," you know. So
That's nice.
and then
Oh,
we would be in the paper
yeah.
because whenever he needed like a summer picture in the pool or a kid
You guys
shoveling
were the
snow, that was
models.
us.
And how many years did your father do that for?
He did it for 38 years.
Oh, God bless him.
And we thought he'd never retire. And they offered him 3.5 years pay when he was 59 and a half. And he said, "I'd have to be stupid to turn that down."
So did he retire
He
too?
retired. He retired, and then he was he started working for a lawyer, and he was actually a chauffeur, but then he would take in whenever they needed a photograph of, of an accident scene or something like that, then he would do the photography. So, and
Nice.
occasionally he would do weddings. Like growing up, he always would do weddings,
So he had a great profession and he had something he could lean on. Do you know what I mean? That sounds wonderful.
That's all he ever wanted to do.
Yeah, nice.
And what happened, he got his big break because World War II, all the photographers were going to war.
Yeah.
And he volunteered and he wanted to be a combat photographer. And they told him that he couldn't be a combat photographer because he didn't have enough experience. But they said, we're going to send you to Signal Corps School in New Jersey, right over here, Fort Monmouth. And you'll get your chance because the average life expectancy for a combat photographer is 6 months.
Oh, gee, are you kidding me?
No.
I want to do
No.
it then.
And then what happened was they found out he had a punctured eardrum and they kicked him out.
Wasn't
And
that classified as a 4F or something? Isn't that what?
yeah, well, I guess he didn't know, or they didn't know when he went in. They found out when he was in there. And so he was working at the news and they made him a photographer right away because all the photographers were in the war.
Oh, that's how he became one. Okay.
Yeah. And then when they came back, then he
Mhm.
was doing newsreels for the local television station for a while, and then he went back into the photography. But
Now, isn't that
those
the best-
guys,
Isn't that the best thing in life, though, that you can say that you loved your profession and that was what your life was about? Seriously, I mean, I think that's the gem.
he's one of the few people I know who loved his job, and they wanted to make him a boss
Yeah.
several times, and he said no, he didn't want to be in the office looking at other people's pictures. He wanted to be out on the street, and that's what he loved. And back then, those guys, you look at the photos that they took 50, 60, 70 years ago, it's amazing. They didn't have, the little camera where
Yeah.
they had this big box and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, seriously, you're right.
But it's amazing. I'll send you a few of his photos so you could
Go
see
ahead, I
some
would
of the
love to
ones.
see them.
So you could see some of the ones
There's a
that they
thing
did.
on Facebook and it's called Old Photos, and you want to see these photos are beautiful. Like to see how they looked back over 100 years ago or even 60 years ago and how they dressed. Like the ladies of what you have behind you, look how beautiful they look.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's
And that was for work. They were working.
See?
They were working. Let's see if I go. That's my
Oh yeah, I love that. I didn't see
the little kid is my uncle, my father's oldest
what's
brother,
it, right? The boy?
the boy,
Oh yeah.
and the man in the hat is my uncle.
Oh wow. So
And
when do you think that was taken?
my great uncle, this was about 1920. So my great uncle and my grandfather were in the business together.
Uh-huh.
The women, I
Yeah.
suspect,
Yeah.
maybe family, but I'm not sure.
Really?
I'm not sure.
Are.
And they made bridal crowns and veils. So before we go, just where for anybody who wants to find either this book or your first book, how would they find it?
Okay, the first book is Love and Loyalty, and the second book is Life's Journey. And you can purchase it through Darren's Publishing, which is out here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or you can get it through Amazon. Either place will have it all the time.
Okay, and I'll be sure to put all the links out there and make sure that everybody can find them.
Okay, that sounds wonderful. Thank you. And if you need me, just let me know.
Okay, all right. Bye-bye.
And thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.